Hey guys, it's Catherine Morgan here and welcome to my YouTube channel. Now this channel is here to bring you short but powerful videos to help you to navigate both the emotional side of money, our relationship with money, and the practical steps to help you to reduce financial anxiety and become more financially empowered to deserve wealth, grow wealth, and create wealth. My name's Catherine and I'm a qualified financial planner and international multi-award winning financial coach. That's a bit of a mouthful. So welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Make sure that you hit the like and subscribe button and do leave me a comment below and let me know what was your biggest takeaway from listening to this video. Speak to you soon. So welcome to today's podcast episode, and I'm absolutely delighted to have on the show today a wonderfully, incredibly inspiring lady, Chantel Chapman. Now, Chantel co-developed and currently runs the Trauma of Money Method, which is Canada's one and only accredited course that certifies professionals in facilitating healing around trauma and money through a decolonized lens. And I've just had the honor of completing my training over the last few months. So a huge welcome to you today, Chantel. How are you?
I'm so good. Thank you so much for having me here. It's so nice to be with you, somewhat face to face.
Yeah. Now, you can imagine, as Chantel's program was run on Canada time, I was actually listening to my training on replay for many months on a Sunday morning. It was the one activity that I was looking forward to the most every Sunday. And I learned so much about integration between mindfulness, trauma, and actually how physically we carry trauma through our bodies. And I learned some incredible practices that I now share with my clients about how we can actually help to reduce some of our own financial anxieties and our own financial trauma that's stored, very somatically in our bodies. And actually the topic that I want to really focus on today's podcast episode and on our video today is around this topic of codependency. So as we get stuck into this subject, Chantel, could you just first of all introduce yourself to my listeners today and just tell them a little bit about what brought you into this space of working around money and trauma?
Yes, thank you so much for asking that. I guess my career started probably a few generations ago in the women lineage in my family. I come from a lineage of women who I would consider them quite oppressed, like many women are, the further we go back in our ancestral lineage. And there was some trauma with my mom as she was carrying me, and she had me when she was 18 years old as a single mother, and we grew up in poverty. So that's when people ask me, like, how did you get into this? That's really where it started, was my own personal experiences around money and growing up in poverty. And then there was some addiction trauma. My stepfather at the time was a heroin addict. So I grew up in a very chaotic environment. You develop certain narratives around money. And one of the narratives that I developed was money equals safety, right? So if we only had money, all the things that felt unsafe to me wouldn't have happened. Which that's not necessarily true, but that's what I developed. And so I did all these really interesting things, like through the lens of that narrative, such as, when I was 16 to 20 years old, I dated someone who was heavily involved in organized crime because he had a lot of money, but he was like a bad guy that could protect me from the bad guys. Like, that's how trauma works, right? And then I snapped out of that narrative, and then I became extremely ambitious in my career. I became a mortgage broker at 21 years old. I don't advise that to anyone because no one trusts a 21-year-old with buying the biggest investment of their lives. And so, through that career, I had all this imposter syndrome, and then it kind of put me on a path where I essentially felt like I needed to surround myself with very, very wealthy people. So my whole life was about like, be around the best, like the wealthiest. And that's how I kind of created my circle, my relationships. And it was so ambitious. It had a very like addictive frequency to it, because it was coming from a place of money equals safety. And I'm not safe until I'm all around this all the time. And in my career as a mortgage broker, I was working with many people who had financial distress, because I was so young, and the only clients I was getting were people who were declined everywhere else. So I was like their last option. And I was noticing like this lack of financial literacy. And then I thought about my own life, and I was really pissed off. I felt like this big sense of injustice. So about 15 years ago, I started a financial literacy company where I thought the answer was to teach teenagers in high school. And that was like my whole thing, like, this is going to change. And I did that for a while, and it was amazing. And then my career kind of expanded. I did quite a bit of corporate consulting for fintech companies. And then I kind of noticed that like teaching financial literacy was not moving the needle at all. It was very much like a band-aid for some deeper issues. And it wasn't until I had kind of a bit of I'd call it a spiritual awakening in my own life caused by pain. Someone in my family was basically almost living on the streets, also doing heroin. And I kind of, as the codependent I am, I needed to save their lives. So I threw myself into that person's recovery. And through being on the path of recovery with them, I realized my own addictions, which were codependency and external validation. And I started linking this like world of addiction recovery and trauma recovery to money. Because I'm like, whoa, like everything that's happening right now is so related to how we show up with money. So that was maybe about, I'd say 6 years ago, I just went on this really big research journey around trauma, addiction recovery, mindfulness, everything, quantum physics. I wanted to kind of study it all and bring it together. And then through that, I partnered with a psychotherapist who specializes in trauma. And then we created the Trauma of Money method, because we found that once you start working on this inner healing and healing the trauma, then we can arrive to a place where we can actually even absorb the financial literacy, right? Because when we're in a triggered state of trauma, like let's say you're a woman who has had sexual trauma from a male authority figure as a child, right? And this is a very dark topic, but important. So 1 in 3 women have had sexual trauma. And so you connect male authority figures to that traumatic experience. And then you enter the world in finance, and you are interacting with many male authority figures. And all of a sudden they're in power, and you are here, and you are traumatized. You can't even absorb what they're saying to you. You might not be able to articulate your needs, so these types of experience really do show up in our relationship with money. And that's a pretty extreme example of trauma, but it could be something as small as, like your mom was working all the time and she didn't make eye contact with you enough, and you didn't feel seen, right? So that's really the essence of my story.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Chantelle. I really resonate with what you're talking there about, sort of the big traumas and little traumas, that like there are some big traumas, abuse being one of them. I've just myself qualified also as a financial abuse specialist, because
Beautiful.
in exactly the same example you've just shared there about, someone who's had a sexual experience, a negative sexual experience, that in itself is a trauma, and that trauma can leave, you know, a huge imprint on how we feel about our own self-worth. And we also know that there's a big connection for women specifically about linking their self-worth with their money. And you know, we hear this in sentences when women say things like, I am not good with money, I am not capable of building a successful business, for example, because every time they say that word I am, it connects their sense of self with money. And I know that this is something that I've been learning about from you in your training program. So with those experiences that you've experienced, Chantelle, and from women that you work with around trauma, how does somebody, first of all, bring any awareness to the fact that there could be a link, therefore, between trauma and addiction and their relationship with money?
Well, I would say the first step is to bring awareness. So, are there any patterns that you have with money that feel negative to you, right? And it's important to do this outside of the realm of traditional financial literacy advice, because traditional financial literacy advice is basically like, how do I say this? So we talk about cognitive distortions in our course, and there's like a whole list of cognitive distortions, like this or that thinking, or overgeneralizing, or fortune telling. One of them is called should statements. So I should do this, I should do that. A lot of financial educators are like, they're shoulding on us. They're like, your portfolio should be like this, your credit score should be like this, right? So how can you bring awareness into your relationship with money and the patterns that are happening outside of the should statements, first of all, right? And so that really takes tuning in and being like, well, you know, I'm noticing that I'm overspending in this category. I can afford it. But it just doesn't feel good to me. There's something about it that doesn't feel good. Or I'm overspending in this category and I can't afford it, right? So that's an obvious, like there's an issue here. So it's first of all bringing some attention to, bringing some awareness, and then looking for patterns. So the piece of the pattern recognition is really important. And then trying to see if these patterns show up in other areas of your life. And then if that is the case, there may be some trauma around there. So for example, if it's overspending, it's like, why am I overspending? Well, I typically tend to buy clothes. Why am I buying clothes? Well, I'm buying clothes because I have to go to this event and I'm really nervous. And if I just have a new dress, I'll feel so much more comfortable. Well, why is that? Like, why does that dress have so much power?
Yeah.
Well, it's not the dress, it's the external validation, right? And so it's like, oh, this is really interesting. I'm noticing this is happening over and over. Where else am I seeking external validation? Oh, well, I just gave that person a big deal on this service that I'm selling right now because I really want to be friends with them, you know, or I really want their approval. So it's like all of a sudden I'm mapping these patterns. And then as I peel these layers back, I'm noticing there's this core belief here. And this core belief is like, I'm only valuable based on the validation that I get from the outside. Right. So right there, we can tell that there's a very old pattern there. That's trauma. Trauma is very old. It's old narratives. And they can even be passed down generationally. Like I said in my story, you know, like I come from a line of women who've been oppressed, you know, so
the hereditary beliefs I find really fascinating. And I remember when you shared this on the training program, I sat there and journaled around my own family patterns. And I'll just very briefly share this while we're talking about this, as I can't remember whether I shared this before, but my mum's dad was in the Japanese prisoner of war camps during the Second World War. And he survived and he came out weighing like 5.5 stone. And his relationship with his body was obviously impacted because of being a prisoner of war. And I remember my nan, she's still alive now, she's like 96, and I remember her telling me this story of how she cooked him rice pudding when he came out, because that was his favorite food. But obviously he wouldn't touch it because he lived on rice for many, many years. And when my mum was 12, he passed away on holiday of a heart attack. And my mum carried a very negative relationship with her body, and so did I. And I always look back now at that and actually wonder whether the reason that I had a negative relationship with my body and my confidence, which led me into patterns of overspending and addiction around spending money, was because of that intergenerational pattern and that intergenerational belief that had been carried through the generations, which as a child you don't even question, right? Because every belief that we carry as a child, the brain doesn't know how to differentiate between fact and fiction. So it just creates this narrative and this story and this meaning behind what we associate with money.
Yes.
And I really want to talk about that today, actually, Chantelle, in terms of like the link between trauma and addiction. Could you just tell us a little bit about what is the link there between trauma and addiction, and how does that create codependency around money?
Yeah, for sure. So a teacher that I've done some studying with who's incredible, Dr. Gabor Mate, he actually lives where I live here in Vancouver, BC. And he defines addiction as when we do something over and over again to temporarily decrease pain and increase pleasure in the moment, but there's negative consequences. So remember when I was explaining, like, how do we even discover if there's trauma? And I said the pattern recognition. So it's like, are we doing it over and over again? Right. So, and that's the thing. Are we doing things to decrease pain? And that is essentially what addiction is. Like you're looking for ways to soothe pain. What's pain? Pain's trauma. Pain is coming most likely from trauma, right? If it's leading to addictive behavior, because there is pain that we can experience that's like normal level of pain, right? As a human being with a whole different type of emotions. But then there's this like ongoing pain that's old pain, right? So for example, we talk about in like behavioral economics, they have this theory, the pain of pain. So when you pay for something that's like, you shouldn't because it's out of your budget, it's normal to feel pain. And you listen to the pain. This is like an indicator, don't do it. But if you feel pain every single time you buy because you have some sort of narrative of, if you do anything for yourself, you're awful. Like that's trauma pain. So one thing they say in the 12-step program is if it's hysterical, it's historical, right? Yeah. So that like really that old pain, that's most likely some sort of trauma that's still existing there that's coming up.
And what does that, if we carry that trauma, what does that lead to in terms of behaviors or habits around money?
Well, what it leads to a disconnection from the present moment. It leads to a disconnection to self, which is essentially codependency. So my favorite definition of codependency is the distance from ease, the dis-ease of the lost self. So we are all born innately worthy, right? We don't have to do anything to be worthy. And this is a trauma narrative of capitalism, is you have to do to be worthy, right? Like I'm only worthy of receiving anything if I give to you a lot. That's not true. Like the moment I show up in any space, I'm already worthy and so are you. And can we operate from that innate worthiness, right? But what happens in our experiences on this earth, in living in the world that we live in, is we will most likely encounter traumas that impact our sense of self and our sense of innate worthiness. So it's like they say in the 12-step program, they say get a program or be programmed. we basically live in a world that is programming us where our worthiness gets chipped away. So we have to work a program to remind ourselves of the innate worthiness.
Yeah, wow. Like, and other than, so we have like capitalism there, like, and society influences on how we view our sense of self and worthiness. What are the other ways in which we are impacted through that lens?
Well, consumerism's main narrative is like, they love to create a problem and sell you a solution. That's consumerism, right? And it's like, if you feel pain, you are defective. If you feel discomfort, you're defective, and you need to fix that. Fix it right away. And guess what? It comes in the form of a convenient product or service that you can purchase, or an experience that you can purchase, right? So we've really been, I'm going to use the word manipulated, because it is a manipulation, that like our emotions of discomfort are mean something's wrong. We're defective, and we shouldn't allow space for them. We should soothe them right away, right? And soothing is important. And it's important to soothe the nervous system. But can you find ways to soothe the nervous system that don't have negative consequences? And that's the thing. Like, we hear treat yourself all the time. Like, I deserve this, treat myself, blah, blah, blah. I'm tired, I'm overworked. But it's like, can you actually nourish yourself instead? Because treat yourself might be like, treat myself in the moment, but there's negative consequences later. So can you nourish yourself instead, which may have less negative consequences, right?
Yeah, I love that. How can we better nourish ourselves
Yeah.
over just treating?
Oh,
Sorry,
sorry, go ahead. Oh, I was gonna say, or instead of treat yourself, reparent yourself. I constantly reparent myself from capitalism. Like, because as a child, I learned all these different things from the society that we live in, and I continue to learn different things from the society that we live in. So I need to reparent myself from those learnings. It's like my own reprogramming, right?
And how do you do that? How do you begin to reparent yourself?
Well, the number one tool is the tool of discernment and critical thinking. So to truly question, some of the messages that you're reading, um, uh, and to do it from a place of knowing your own innate worthiness. And that's a deep practice, and it takes a while to get to that place, right? But it's a constant, daily practice of affirmation. It's a daily practice of, when those negative thoughts come in, that like, oh, I better do something so these people can like me. It's like, okay, let's slow down. What are you noticing here? Are you noticing that, you're almost giving too much in order to be welcome? Why are you doing that? You're already welcome, right? So yeah. And then finding other ways to, we call it, in the trauma of money, we call it the window of resilience, but in traditional psychology, it's called the window of tolerance. And it's like finding ways to get into that window of resilience. And that window of resilience is in the middle of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Outside of the window is essentially like some sort of chaos where you're having a trauma reaction. So finding ways that we can get into that window on a daily basis is important, because that's the thing that is also a myth, is when you start doing trauma recovery work, it doesn't fully go away completely. You just really recover faster, because healing is non-linear, right? And it's truly about peeling layers back. So allowing yourself space for that, and allowing yourself, like, without shaming yourself, if something new does come up and you're like, I thought I worked on this, it's like, okay, I'm at now. I'm just going to use my tools, and I'm going to recover faster from the time before.
Yeah, and I love that question that you can share with yourself. Where am I in this window of resilience right now, in the present moment? Where am I?
Yeah. Yeah, that's so important, because we have found that, someone can't, I teach a lot of groups, like I do a lot of group education, and I find that I teach a lot of entrepreneurs too. And I find that anytime we're going into like the financial pro forma financial projections, if anyone's feeling a little bit of like imposter syndrome, or they're like, I'm not good at math or anything, they're just going to shut down. They're most likely going to go into a collapse, or they're going to go on their phone. They're just not going to engage. So it's a constant practice. Like when you open up your budget, where am I in my window of resilience? I'm noticing I'm here. What am I going to do to get into it so I can actually handle my finances? Or I think I want to buy this thing. Where am I in my window of resilience? Right.
And you talked there, Chantel, about like fight, flight, and
Yeah.
fawning. Now, I'm conscious that some people may have never heard that expression before. What does fawning mean in the context of money?
Well, so we know fight, flight, and freeze, right? The interesting thing about this is that I think it was like in 1930s when the psychologists were basically researching trauma reactions. They did a study, and I believe they studied 1,000 men on trauma reactions. And they found that the common trauma reactions were fight, flight, or freeze. Here's the issue though. Where were the women in the study, right? So as further research came out, they found that there's another trauma reaction called fawning, or called tend and befriend. And this doesn't actually just relate to women. Men can do it too, but it's more common in women. Is that when women feel like we're in a state of being unsafe or in a trauma triggered state, we may go to a place of fawning, which is essentially people pleasing. So codependency is people pleasing, right? So that's why codependency, which is an addiction, is a trauma reaction, right? Taking heroin is a trauma reaction. Compulsive spending, most likely a trauma reaction, right? And so if you think about it too, like back a long time ago, when we're living in communities on the land, and one community takes over another, let's say there's women there with her children, she most likely can't fight. She most likely can't grab all her kids and run. So what is she going to do to ensure the survival of her and her babies? She's going to tend and befriend maybe the new warlord who took over the village, right? And this is where like women often, often like women have been told throughout generations that we don't have like direct access to power. And we've developed very good manipulation skills in order to access power. So like subtle power. And it is very manipulating to be codependent, right? So like, I'll buy you things so I feel safe, or like, I'll give you a deal. Oh, we don't have to go through those contract terms on our agreement here. Like, I just really want you to like me and I don't want any conflict. Yeah.
Yeah, it's that the people pleaser role, that kind of part of you that can come out to play. We interviewed a guest on the podcast actually a few months back around the people pleaser specifically, because I think generationally as well, like it's in our DNA because of those inherited patterns, the influences of culture. I mean, British culture, and I'm sure the Canadian culture is we've got different examples of where this is carried through into generationally into our own beliefs. And we're not even necessarily aware that we literally carry those in our DNA. And
Yes.
that I think for a lot of women, they feel specifically that we have to be that caregiver and we have to have that relationship with money as well as with ourselves.
Yeah. And it's really, I thank you for saying that. It's also important to value some of our cultural traditions. So codependency, extreme codependency would be like, I will do everything for your comfort and completely ignore my comfort, right? Constant people pleasing and not having your own needs met, right? However, the opposite of that, like the good behavior of that, or the healed codependent, is not someone who doesn't give to community or who is not helpful, because if you go to one end of the spectrum to another, it's probably very unhealthy. So where can you find that middle ground, right? And honoring your cultural worldviews. So I work a lot with many Indigenous communities in Canada, and in the Indigenous worldview, there's a very strong focus on when we're all healthy, or when, you know, when not everyone is healthy, we're not healthy. So we all need to be healthy. Or like when I will be prosperous when the community is prosperous. Yeah. Right. So there's a lot of like community care focus and lens within the Indigenous communities. But then thrown into colonialism and capitalism, it's like competitive, like create wealth for yourself, or like your own little family, and you know, generational wealth between only your family lineage, and it's less about the community focus and the community care. Right. So it's important as like us as financial educators that we don't push any specific way to be, right? Because my codependency from my cultural view would look very different maybe from an Indigenous person and their worldview, right? So it's really important to honor where your cultural views come from. And I might even say, well, my cultural view, and this is where discernment comes in, is very colonized. It's very capitalist. It's very oppressive. This is what my family's kind of learned. So maybe I do want to look at different models, such as the Indigenous worldview, which is about sustainability, sustainable community care. And guess what? In sustainable community care, everyone's needs need to be met, including the codependent who likes to give. So if I'm giving everything, my needs aren't met, right? So you can, and going back to cognitive distortions, we love to be like this or that thinking. It's either this or that. You're either codependent or you take care of your community. No, you can be both, this and that. You can be, I have all my needs met and I take care of my community.
Yeah, right? I love that. It, like you say, it's not one over the other. It's about honoring what that brings to us in terms of our values and our way of life and our way of living, and not having to feel like we have to choose one over the other.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Wow. Like, and that also reminds me of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where they, you know, he talks about your psychological and basic needs being met. And I hear a lot of this from women who are overgiving with their relationship with money, in that they don't fulfill their own needs, they fulfill other people's needs ahead of their own. And that can be very rewarding in many ways, but it can also be very damaging in terms of fulfilling their own needs. So I love that. I love that description about kind of, it doesn't need to be an either or, we just need to seek some balance.
Yeah. And also understand the principle of sustainability, right? Like, I find like, I really love ecology and deep ecology. And I feel like there's so much wisdom there. And it's like, the way the earth will be sustainable is like, we can take tips from that, of like how we can be sustainable. Yeah. So like, for things to grow, the soil needs to be taken care of, right? So imagine yourself as the soil. So how can we nourish the soil to allow growth, and not just our own growth, but community growth?
I'm very visual. I'm already just visualizing this.
Yeah.
Being the soil, and making sure that our basic needs are being met at root, at grassroots level.
Yeah. And a lot of people believe that like they're only worthy of their needs met if they do something first. And this is what I love about actually the 12-step program, talking about addiction, is the last step is about being of service, but there's all this other stuff that we do first, that is truly about like reconciling with ourselves and tuning into our own worthiness, right? So it's like you are innately worthy, and you really need to build that foundation. And versus being like, you have to do all these things to be worthy. Like, you don't have to be Mother Teresa to be worthy. You know, you don't, like, you are already worthy. And when you serve from a place of worthiness and abundance, it has such a more profound impact versus serving from scarcity. Serving from scarcity is it's a bit self-serving in a bit of a manipulative way, and it leads to resentment if there's no reciprocity. Yeah.
Yeah, and most of us operate from a place of scarcity or abundance because of our relationship with money. And
That's right. Yeah.
I just love I mean, I feel like I could chat with you for hours on this
we
subject.
probably could.
It's so fascinating. And just to finish on this topic then today, Chantelle, for anyone listening to this that's really resonating, connecting in with some of these patterns, or wanting to be maybe just more curious around this for themselves, is there one exercise or tool or question that they could take away today, or having listened to this, that they could use to explore this gently with themselves?
Well, my favorite question is, whose shame is this?
I'm so glad you said that. That was one of the best questions you shared in your training program.
Yeah. That's my favorite, is, whose shame is this? And just like asking yourself, you know, why, I'm feeling unworthy. Like, whose shame is this? Who does this belong to? And bringing some awareness to that, and be like, and then maybe closing your eyes and just imagine yourself putting that shame in a box and being like, I'm going to give this back to you. Here you go. You can deal with that. Even if it's like talking about generations. And I heard this from one of my dear friends who is so incredibly wise. And she's told me that one of her friends said to her, she was carrying some generational trauma, and she said, what if you just gave it back to them? What if you just gave it back to your ancestors? And as codependents, we don't want to do that, because I want to take care of everyone. I want to fix my ancestors' issue, right? I want to take care of that, because I don't want my ancestors to have more pain. But like, we disempower people when we do that, right? So what if we just imagine giving it back to where it came from, and giving it back in the most loving way, saying like, I know that you are empowered enough to handle this yourself, and you can give it back to where it originally came from. Right?
Yeah. And by changing this for ourselves as well, we're able to not just change our own blueprint in how we choose to operate, but also the future generations. You know, think about, if we can change it for ourselves, we're almost stopping that trauma, that shame, the guilt, all of the emotions which are supportive. They're not all negative emotions. I think there's a lot of talk, isn't there, about guilt, shame, judgment, all of these emotions which people consider to be negative, but actually they do serve a purpose. They serve a purpose to give us information. They serve a purpose to protect us from pain and harm.
Absolutely.
So I love that. Just that I can, you know, a visual concept of putting it in a box and passing it back to the generations, but recognizing that there's been some value there, not just it's been negative to me, but there's been some value in that too.
Absolutely. Yeah. We talk about this in the course, internal family systems, and we call them loyal soldiers, right? Is like, wow, thank you for you know, helping me see that I need to be a little bit more cautious around people. I needed that in this situation. I don't need that in that situation. So what you're giving back, you're not giving back the lessons, you're giving back the shame and the pain, right? Like, okay, I've felt this, I've worked through this, I've held space for this, I'm going to give this back, and I empower you to heal it yourself, and then give it back and keep passing it back and seeing how far it goes. Wow. Incredible. Thank you so much, Chantelle, for sharing some wisdom with us today. If anybody would like to connect with you and find out more about your training programs and your services, what would be the best way for them to get in touch with you today? Yeah, well, the best is, we have our website, www.thetraumaofmoney.com. We've got a spring cohort starting in March. And you can follow us on Instagram at The Trauma of Money. You can follow me at Chantel Chapman.
Great, thank you. And we'll pop all of those links underneath this video and in the show notes to the podcast. Thank you so much, Chantel, for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for listening, guys. I really hope that you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please do me a big favor and leave me a comment below this video and let me know, what was your one biggest takeaway? What are you going to do differently as a result of watching today's video? Now, you can go ahead and check out more free resources available to you at the website, which is themoneypanel.co.uk, or please feel free to tune into our weekly podcast on all of the typical podcast channels. That's In Her Financial Shoes. And remember, small steps, big wins. Let's go.